Welcome into a brand new edition of the 06010 ESPN Communications podcast. I'm your host, Alex Feuz, and we are joined by the one and only Buster Olney, ESPN Sunday Night Baseball analyst and senior writer for ESPN.com. Buster, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today. Walk me through, when did you become a baseball fan?
Oh man, a baseball fan. When I was about 8 years old, my mom got me a book on Sandy Koufax. He's growing up in Vermont, and I had played Little League, but she got me a book on Koufax. It made me a crazy Dodger fan, and I think that was the same summer she also got me 2 packs of baseball cards, which she always regretted after that. So I was kind of hooked at that point.
Do you remember any of the cards you got? Were there any players that stuck out to you looking back at
Yeah,
it?
first 2 cards that I got were a Lee May card and a Gary Sutherland card. Okay, both with the Houston Astros at that time. And the funny thing was, I didn't know this, but the Lee May card was an error card on the back, and it was like Lee May hit 0-0-0 in the World Series, and it was supposed to be some good statistic, and it was 0-0-0, and it took me a few years to learn that was a mistake.
I know a lot of people would put them in the bikes books. Did you do that too?
No. But I did not take care of them. I wound up collecting like 30,000 cards.
Oh my
I'd
God.
go up to Floyd's General Store, which was in Randolph Center, and I would order boxes of baseball cards, but I would sort them out on the floor of my bedroom, and they would get knocked around a lot, and they wound up actually being all in a big trunk out in the barn because I grew up on a dairy farm, and some water damage went into them. And I've always wondered about, man, how many cards did I buy and what would they be worth if I had actually taken care of them?
How many do you still have?
No, I just have a couple of boxes,
Okay.
something that were remotely, and I haven't looked at them in years. I think I'm waiting for either my son or maybe some other big baseball fan who would be interested.
Yeah. Well, let's get into it. This is your 14th year working on Sunday Night Baseball and the third with Eduardo, Karl, and David. Walk us through, how has that relationship with Karl, Eduardo, and David evolved over the last 3 seasons working together for Sunday Night Baseball?
Yeah, and known each one of them in different ways. I mean, David Cone was a player who I covered when I was at the New York Times. He was on the Yankees, and I covered him for 3 seasons. And he was one of my favorite guys to cover because he loved to talk baseball. And so now we're in a position where not only on air, but getting breakfast on Sunday morning, walking to the ballpark. After the game, we tape what we call a clown car episode of the podcast, and it's super fun for me to continue those conversations. Eduardo, I first met as a player, and of course Karl, I've been doing baseball tonights with since the mid 2000s after I joined ESPN, and it does feel like you have old acquaintances, old friends when you're having these conversations. Everyone's very comfortable, no one's feeling threatened. We all throw out, ideas, and some of them are good and some of them are bad, and we don't have a problem laughing at ourselves when they don't turn out so great.
What's been the best and what's been one that you've kind of had to work on for ideas?
Um, the best one, we lucked into this. It was an organic interview that we did during a Dodger Padre game when there was a fan who was in left center field who we could see, when Manny Machado hit a home run, he caught Manny Machado's home run ball, and immediately you could see him stick the home run ball, or hold the home run ball, but he reached into the pocket of his jacket and took out a different baseball and threw it back on the field. And I remember seeing it on a replay, and I just blurted out, pushed the button that puts myself on air, and just blurted out, "Look, he switched the balls." And so we went out and I interviewed the fan, and I could see him when I walked up to him that it was like he was like a bank robber who got caught in the way that he described it, where he was like, "Okay, who was the first one to notice?" This is the conversation we had off air before I interviewed him on air. He was like, "Who's the first one to notice?" And I was like, "I think it was me. Me and Eduardo may have seen it." And he was shaking his head, and then he explained what his whole thought process was. That was a lot of fun. You never know when you go walk up to a fan how they're going to handle that moment, but he was absolutely great. I think if I remember correctly, his name is Renan.
That's a great moment. Absolutely fun moment. You mentioned the podcast too, the Baseball Tonight podcast. How long have you been doing this now?
So I actually had forgotten how long, and then a listener, sent me a note the other day that it's been on for 12 years. I remember talking to Mike McQuaid, who was overseeing baseball coverage at that time, and I said, "Look, I just would love to have a podcast so I could have a regular conversation with my good friends, Jason Stark and Tim Kirkjian and Jerry Krasnick." And it kind of grew from there. So 12 years doing the podcast. For I think the first 10 years we were doing 5 days a week. Just a lot of fun, to follow the news and to talk about trends in baseball, and now to have clown car editions and talk to Sarah Langs a couple times a week. There's never a bad time for that. To catch up with Tim, Karl Ravech, Eduardo. I love doing that.
What's been your favorite moment on the podcast?
Well, I had one moment when I was taping it one out in LA where a security guard was wondering if I was like, drunk sitting in the, because I'm sitting there and I had headphones on. And I think he thought I was talking to myself. It was during a World Series the Dodgers were in. It may have been 2017, but we had to tape it early. So we're taping like 5 a.m. West Coast time, 8 o'clock Eastern time. And I'm up, and the security guard comes over and like doubles back, like, "What are you doing here?" And I've had two or three run-ins. Through the years, we've had what we call Baggage Claim Monday, where I'll try to find a quiet place in an airport. Good luck with that. When you're going through airports like Atlanta, and to talk baseball. And I've had, different security people come up to me and wonder, what I was doing in some remote corner of the airport, like stuff myself into the back. And one time in St. Louis, I started a taping. It was at 5:30 in the morning. And they have those kids play areas, and they had one of those kiddie cars, and I was like, this is perfect. I can set my laptop up, I can have the screen here. And then 20 minutes later, people start arriving at the airport, and there was like a mom and three kids, and they're like going through the play area. I think the mom was looking at me like, okay, who's this weirdo who's talking baseball in the middle of the kiddie play area?
That's amazing. You mentioned you grew up on a dairy farm, and we'll get to that in the Fast Five at the end of the show. But you do wake up early. Does that go back to your time growing up on the
Yeah.
farm?
Oh, no question. Yeah, I had to be my stepdad would go out to milk the cows at 5 a.m. And so at that time, we had a heat duct in our house, and he would yell up through the heat duct, stir. And I knew that I needed to be out the barn in 10 minutes. And so now, as an adult, when I wake up, it's like boom, like ready to go as soon as I wake up. That's something a friend has told me it's like a superpower.
That's great. You obviously cover the Yankees as a beat writer. How has this industry shifted and evolved over the last few years? Obviously, you've kind of done a little bit of everything,
Yeah.
writing, and then now working on the TV, hosting a podcast. So, how has this whole industry shifted over the last 20, 30 years?
Well, I mean, certainly, and the reason why I left the New York Times to go to ESPN was because you could see on the horizon that you had to do a range of things. You couldn't just be a writer. You had to be able to communicate on radio and do that on a regular basis. In my last years at the New York Times, I remember we had a couple of editors who said, "Hey, can you tape like an audio element after you do your game story?" And when I first heard, it was like, "Oh man, what a pain." Like staying up and doing that. And they were like, "No, this is the future." And I was like, "Yeah, sure. Yeah, okay, whatever." It just felt like extra work at the time. And now it turned out that's exactly where we are. So I think having the wherewithal to work on multiple platforms is absolutely crucial. And of course, social media changes everything with how quickly the information's being conveyed to readers and to listeners. I mean, when I worked at the New York Times, you might get a news break at 11 o'clock in the morning that people wouldn't know about for till the next morning. It's the news moves so quickly compared to when I first started.
How has your social media strategy for your own accounts shifted over the last few years?
It's interesting because I work on Twitter quite a bit. And when I first started on Twitter, I really liked it a lot because I would think of myself as, growing up on a small town in Vermont, and only having like one newspaper every Sunday. Like I didn't really have access to a lot of information. So I love the idea if you were a young baseball fan that you would have instant access to information like on your phone or on your computer, and that seemed really cool. But it does feel like at times, man, no matter what you throw out there, you got a lot of people coming back at you. The tone of it is very different than when we first started.
Buster, this is my favorite part of any interview I do. It's the Fuse Fast Five. It's five quick
Okay.
questions. Are you ready?
Yeah.
All right. You grew up on a farm. Like so did I. I grew up on a hay farm. What was your favorite and least favorite part of growing up on a farm?
My favorite part was splitting wood, and my least favorite part was stacking hay in the middle of the summertime at the top of the barn. Because as you know, it was like 110 degrees and the humidity was ridiculous. Those were the toughest days.
Yeah, we still have a hay farm and it's terrible. It's hard work. And of course it's always the nicest part of the summertime. That's the best time to do it, and especially on the hot days because that's when the hay dries the quickest. And those are the worst days. So growing up,
But there's no
yeah.
but there's nothing better than to have like a drink of cold water after you've been
Oh
at
yeah,
the top of the barn stacking.
no doubt. You mentioned you're a native of Vermont. Who is the greatest baseball player to come out of Vermont?
Carlton Fisk. Okay. I know New Hampshire likes to claim him, but he was actually born in the state of Vermont. Okay. Now, we have some other honorable mentions. Ernie Johnson, who's the father of the, TNT's Ernie Johnson. He was a great one as well, but I'd say it's got to be Carlton Fisk.
The legendary voice of the Yankees, John Sterling, retired a few weeks ago. What was your favorite John Sterling story?
Wow. It's hard to beat the one last year where he got hit by the foul ball and he was like, ow, oh, oh, which was classic John. I always told my kids, people would talk about him being a homer, and I'd say, no, 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 no. He always tells you exactly what the Yankees are doing wrong. When they playing poorly, he'll tell you why. And I would tell my kids when we would turn on the games in the radio, I would tell them whether they were winning or losing by the tone of his voice. Okay, if I could hear it in his voice if John was mad because the Yankees were losing. He was just disgusted whenever they were losing.
Fourth one, you obviously talked about just everything you love on the podcast side, but let's say you started a new one. Who's one person in your phone contacts you would love to host a podcast with?
Man, Cal Ripken Jr., who I covered as a player for 2 years. And I've always said this, one of my great regrets from my career is I didn't get as much out of Cal, that great baseball mind, as I could have. Because at that time he was the Iron Man. He had just broken Gehrig's record. He was kind of hard to get to. I would have loved to have done it and tapped into that. And among current players, Mike Trout, like he would be fun to host a podcast with. We get him going with baseball talk because he's always one of those players who, after you ask him questions, he'll look at you and say, "Hey, what do you got on Mookie Betts? What stories do you have about other players?" He's totally a great sports fan.
Who is the best player? If you could pick a favorite mic'd up moment on Sunday Night Baseball, which one would you say that was one of my personal favorites?
Okay. I don't think there's a close second, and it's when Freddie Freeman narrated in a spring training game a pop-up scoring from first base. From the time the ball that went up in the air and he yells to the booth, "There's wind, boys!" And called the play as he circled and he slid across home plate and looked up to the booth and gave a safe sign. Chipper Jones, Boog Shambi, I think, were in the booth.
Buster, my last one for you. If a 14-year-old kid walked up to you today and said, "Why should I be a baseball fan?" What would you say to him or her?
I'd say this. I mean, I love the competition itself, but I love the backstories among the players. You get people from all over the world, all different kinds of backgrounds, and to then be competing on this field where you have small people and large people, and it's a sport where you have small people, you have large people, guys who like Jose Altuve, smaller than a sports writer, up to Aaron Judge. And it really is a great melting pot of people and personalities.
Buster, thanks so much for joining the 06010 ESPN Communications podcast today. Greatly appreciate your time.
Thanks, Alex.